Most players plateau not because they lack talent, but because they are solving the wrong problems. As someone who has already navigated the fundamentals, you know how quickly the subtleties of position, initiative, and psychology can shape a game. Here, the focus shifts to the moments when a familiar position reveals unexpected complexity, when a pawn structure or minor imbalance signals a turning point, and when the board demands both precision and creativity. The tension between calculation and intuition is ever present, and each move becomes an opportunity to redefine the course of the game. In these quiet moments at the board, the details matter. Every choice at the board, whether to push forward or hold back, reflects how deeply you understand the principles beneath the surface. Sometimes, a bold sacrifice or a subtle maneuver can transform the entire character of the game. Other times, it is patience and restraint that lead to a decisive breakthrough. The psychological interplay between players, the pressure of the clock, and the shifting landscapes of the middle game and endgame all invite you to adapt and remain flexible, demanding constant adaptation. As you listen, let the rhythm of advanced chess strategies engage your mind. Explore the intricacies of sacrificial calculation, counterplay under pressure, and dynamic material imbalance. If you find these insights useful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your thoughtful comments are always appreciated. Settle in and let's get started. Chapter 1: Exploiting Pawn Structures. Every chess position has a skeleton, and that skeleton is the pawn structure. Strip away all the pieces and look only at the pawns, and you will see the true backbone of the position. This structure tells you which plans make sense and which ones do not, even before you start considering where your pieces might go. The shape of the pawns and how they relate to each other often matters more than the opening moves that got you there. Some pawn structures come up again and again, each one bringing its own set of rules and possibilities. Pawn chains, isolated pawns, doubled pawns, backward pawns, and hanging pawns are the recurring shapes you will encounter. Each one carries its own strategic logic, and recognizing which structure you are dealing with is the first step toward choosing the right plan. The reason this matters is that pawn structures decide which files are open for rooks, which diagonals are free for bishops, and which squares can become strong outposts for knights. Consider the case of when the center is locked with pawn chains. Knights usually become more valuable because they can jump over the closed lines, while bishops struggle to find good squares. In contrast, when the center is open and pawns have been exchanged, bishops and rooks can sweep across the board and control long lines. The structure also tells you where to attack and where to defend. If you have a pawn chain, a common plan is to advance and attack in the direction the chain points. If you are facing a pawn chain, attacking the base is often the most effective approach, since breaking it can undermine the whole structure. Not all pawn structures are balanced. Some make your life easier. Others create long-term problems that do not go away until the pawns are exchanged or the structure is changed by force. Take an isolated pawn. It often needs constant protection from your pieces, which can tie them down and limit their scope. A backward pawn can become a target, because the square in front of it is hard to defend and easy for your opponent to occupy. Doubled pawns are often weak because they cannot protect each other, and may leave open files that your opponent can use for their own pieces. These weaknesses shape the plans you should choose. If you have hanging pawns, you might use them to gain space and push for an attack. But if your opponent can force you to advance them too soon, they can become isolated and weak. What matters most is learning to look at the pawn structure and let it guide your thinking. Standard plans from opening theory tend to be most effective when they fit the pawn structure you actually have. As the game moves into the middle, the pawns often shift, and the whole position can change character. The habit to build is to pause and reassess each time pawns move or are exchanged. Do not assume that a plan that worked in one structure will work in another. This shift toward dynamic evaluation is the start of real strategic thinking. Once you can see how pawn structures guide the flow of the game, the next step is to spot weaknesses in those structures. A pawn is weak if it cannot be defended by another pawn and must rely on your pieces for protection, tying them down and limiting their scope. Isolated pawns, backward pawns, and doubled pawns are the most common examples. A pawn is also weak if it is stuck on a square where your opponent can attack it, and it cannot move forward without being captured. The key to exploiting these weaknesses is patience and precision. The classic method is to restrain the pawn so it cannot advance, then blockade it with a piece, and finally attack it with multiple pieces until it falls. For an isolated pawn, you might blockade it with a knight and double your rooks on the file to pile on pressure. For a backward pawn, the focus is on controlling the square in front of it and using open files to increase the threat. Hanging pawns can be strong if they are mobile, but if you can provoke them to advance at the wrong moment, they may become isolated and easy targets. A common mistake is to rush the attack before your own pieces are ready, or to focus on a well-defended pawn while ignoring a more vulnerable target elsewhere. Sometimes, players push their own pawns too far when attacking, creating weaknesses in their own position. The strongest approach is to scan for weak pawns that cannot be easily defended, and to coordinate your pieces before committing to an attack. When there are several weaknesses, the right idea is to go after the one that is hardest for your opponent to defend and easiest for you to reach. Not every weakness is a target you can attack right away. Sometimes the weakness is only meaningful if you can bring your pieces to bear without creating problems for yourself. It is important to recognize which weaknesses are static and which are dynamic, since that distinction determines how urgently you need to act and how much risk is justified in pursuing them. Over time, the goal is to weigh the cost of going after a weakness against the risk of overextending your own position. There are times when the best way to change the character of the game is to sacrifice a pawn for a different kind of advantage. This is where the focus shifts from static evaluation, where you count material and look for weaknesses, to dynamic assessment, where you look at what new possibilities open up if you give up a pawn. Think about what happens when a pawn sacrifice gives you development, opens lines for your pieces, secures key squares, or creates lasting pressure against the enemy king or structure. Sometimes, giving up a pawn destroys your opponent's pawn structure, or fixes their pawns on squares that make your pieces stronger. The decision to sacrifice a pawn is never simple. You have to weigh the long-term benefits against the immediate loss of material. The risk is that if you do not get enough in return, you are just a pawn down for nothing. There is also the danger that the open lines you create might help your opponent more than they help you. If your opponent can neutralize your initiative, you might end up with both a material deficit and a weak structure. A sound positional pawn sacrifice is one where the compensation is clear and lasting, whether that means more active pieces, a better structure, or sustained pressure your opponent cannot easily neutralize. Timing is critical. You need to see whether your opponent can consolidate, or if you can keep the initiative long enough to make the sacrifice worthwhile. The more you practice looking for these opportunities and weighing their consequences, the more comfortable you will become with shifting from a static to a dynamic mindset. As you move forward, focus on understanding pawn structures as living frameworks that shape and reshape your plans. This approach will prepare you for the next chapter, where we delve into the concept of imbalances and how they influence your strategic decisions. Chapter 2: Understanding Imbalances. Not every chess position is decided by tactics. Often, the game turns on subtler differences between the two sides. Differences in piece types, pawn structure, king safety, or activity. These are imbalances, and learning to read them is what separates reactive players from those who steer the game. Among the most instructive of these is the minor piece imbalance, where each side holds a different combination of bishops and knights. For example, one side might have 2 bishops, while the other has a bishop and a knight. These imbalances shape how you should approach the middle game. The first step is to understand how bishops and knights differ in practice. Bishops control long diagonals and can influence both sides of the board quickly, but only on squares of their own color. Knights move in an L shape and can reach squares of both colors, and uniquely among pieces they can jump over other pieces, though they typically require several moves to cross the board. In open positions where pawns are scattered and there are few blockades, bishops gain power. They can sweep across the board and coordinate attacks at a distance. In closed positions, with locked pawn chains and little open space, knights tend to outshine bishops. Knights can maneuver around blockades, find strong outposts, and apply pressure where bishops are limited. The value of a bishop or a knight depends on the pawn structure. If the board has many pawns fixed on one color, that can limit the strength of a bishop of the same color, since it blocks its own path. If pawns are fixed on the opposite color, the bishop is freed to operate on open lines. Knights become especially strong when they can occupy a protected outpost, particularly in positions where pawns cannot chase them away. The bishop pair tends to be a long-term asset in positions where play can shift from one side of the board to the other, since together they cover all squares and can coordinate threats across the full board. However, if the center is locked and outposts are available, a well-placed knight can dominate a passive bishop. A common mistake among improving players is to trade a strong bishop for a knight without considering how the pawn structure will change, or to ignore the potential of rerouting a knight to a powerful outpost. The main practice to build is to compare the activity and potential of your minor pieces, not just their raw value, before making exchanges. The question to ask is, which minor piece will be more effective given the structure on the board? This discipline leads to more flexible and accurate planning. Beyond minor piece imbalances, chess positions are shaped by dynamic and static advantages. A dynamic advantage is a short-term edge, such as having more active pieces, a lead in development, or the initiative. These advantages do not last unless you act. For example, if you have a development lead, you might threaten your rival before they finish mobilizing. If you wait, your edge disappears as they catch up. Dynamic advantages require you to play with energy and often to take risks, pressing your rival before your advantage fades. A static advantage, in contrast, is a long-term asset. This could be a better pawn structure, control of a key square, or a bishop pair in a stable position. These advantages persist unless your rival makes a concerted effort to change the situation. For example, a knight on a protected outpost, where no pawn can attack it, is a static advantage. It will remain strong unless you or your rival exchange it off or restructure the pawns. The key distinction is that dynamic advantages are fleeting and must be used quickly, while static advantages endure and can be built upon. In practical play, the challenge is to know when to convert one kind of advantage into another. Sometimes you use a dynamic edge, like an attack or a lead in development, to win material or force weaknesses in your rival's camp, turning your short-term pressure into a lasting static advantage. Other times you might hold a static advantage but need to use it dynamically, opening lines or sacrificing material to create immediate threats. Evaluating a position with imbalances involves a systematic process. Start by identifying any material or minor piece differences. Then compare piece activity on both sides. Which side's pieces are more mobile and control more important squares? Next, assess king safety. Even a slight imbalance can become decisive if one king is exposed. Check for structural pawn weaknesses covered in the previous chapter, which can tip the balance. Only after mapping these factors should you choose a plan. The decision process centers on what each side can realistically achieve with the imbalances present. For example, if you have the bishop pair in an open position with pawns on both flanks, look for ways to open more lines and coordinate threats. If your knight sits on an unassailable outpost in a closed position, focus on increasing its influence and limiting your rival's pieces. Consider whether you can improve your piece activity without creating new weaknesses, and whether you can create multiple threats to stretch their defenses. Sometimes the right plan is to open or close the position to favor your own minor piece. If your bishop is trapped behind its own pawns, look for pawn breaks to free it. If your knight wants an outpost, consider how to engineer one by advancing or exchanging pawns. Be careful, though, not to overextend in pursuit of space or activity. Advancing pawns too far can create new weaknesses that your rival can attack. The mindset to cultivate is one that sees imbalances as opportunities to be used, not as problems to be solved. Every meaningful difference on the board is a potential lever for a plan. The practice is to scan for these differences, weigh their potential, and choose actions that make your own advantages more lasting or your rival's position more uncomfortable. With practice, you begin to see each position less as a puzzle with a single answer, and more as a landscape of shifting possibilities, where your task is to read the terrain and steer the game toward the imbalances that favor you. Chapter 3: Mastering the Initiative. Who is making the threats, and who is forced to answer them? That question sits at the heart of the initiative, and it has nothing to do with who has more material or a better structure. When you have the initiative, you decide the pace. Your moves pose problems that your opponent cannot ignore. Their choices narrow, and they spend their time responding to you, instead of carrying out their own plans. At higher levels, the initiative is treated as a dynamic, temporary advantage, rather than a stable asset. It fades unless you keep generating new threats. For example, when one side has a lead in development and the opponent's king is still exposed, the attacking side often has the initiative. The same is true when open lines point at the enemy king, or when a passed pawn is about to promote and the defender must keep it under control. Unlike a material advantage that stays with you unless you give it away, the initiative must be actively maintained. If you stop making threats, your opponent will eventually start making their own. That is why top players act quickly when they sense the initiative is theirs. They use forcing moves, checks, captures, and direct attacks to keep the other side on the defensive. Strong players often sacrifice material to gain the initiative. Sometimes this means giving up a pawn to open lines against the king, or to activate their pieces. The value comes from the threats they generate, not the material they lose. But this only works if the threats are real and continuous. If the defender survives without damage, the initiative fades and the material deficit remains. One way to keep the initiative is to find your least active piece and improve it. Each new threat should come from a fresh source. If you only rely on one or two pieces, your attack will run out of steam. This is where tempo becomes critical. Each move should either make a threat or improve your position while limiting your opponent's options. In most cases, going several moves without posing a direct threat will cause the initiative to slip away. Waiting moves, or moves that do not force a response, can be a sign that the attacker is running low on threats. At that point, the defender can start to take over. For this reason, initiative must be converted into something concrete: material gain, a weakened enemy king, or a lasting positional edge before the defender organizes their forces. The practical effect of the initiative is that it makes your opponent uncomfortable. They cannot play the moves they want. Instead, they are busy parrying threats, and their plans are put on hold. The ability to seize and keep the initiative is one of the main reasons top players can turn even neutral positions into winning chances. Knowing when to push forward and when to hold back is a skill that separates strong players from the rest. Aggression tends to work best when you have a lead in development, or when the enemy king is uncastled and exposed. It is also justified when your opponent has clear targets, like weak squares or pinned pieces, and your own pieces are active and coordinated. Before launching an attack, strong players check that their own king is safe and their pieces work together. If your king is still in the center, or your pieces are undeveloped, attacking can backfire. The same is true if you have a vulnerable back rank or loose pieces that the opponent can target. In these cases, it is better to consolidate your position first. Overextension is a common danger. When pieces venture too far or pawns push without support, the resulting weaknesses can be permanent, and pieces left out of position cannot help defend the king. An ambitious pawn push that fails to break through can expose your own king and invite tactical blunders. On the other hand, too much caution can be just as costly. If you play only defensive moves when you have the chance to attack, your opponent will use the time to organize their forces and take over the initiative. The key is to balance risk and reward. Look for moments when your pieces are active, your king is safe, and the opponent's weaknesses are clear. That is the time to be bold. When defending, strong players exchange off attacking pieces to reduce the pressure. Sometimes they give back material to eliminate the most dangerous threats or to reach a safer structure. Centralizing and coordinating defensive pieces helps absorb the attack. Blocking open lines and creating a shield in front of the king are common ways to neutralize threats. Accurate calculation is vital. Sometimes an intermediate move or a counterattack can turn the tables. The practice to develop is to pause and weigh whether your position calls for more aggression or for consolidation. Neither approach is always correct. The art is in reading the board and judging which path carries the least risk for the most gain. Regaining the initiative often means finding counterplay, activating a passive piece, seeking threats on the other side of the board, or returning material to open lines. Counterattacking overextended enemy pawns or exchanging off the opponent's most active pieces can shift the balance and put them back on the defensive. A mistake many players make is to keep playing non-forcing moves after an attack fails, instead of reassessing and finding a new plan. Sometimes the best way to regain momentum is to accept a small loss, stabilize the position, and look for new imbalances to exploit. The initiative is not lost forever. With materials still on the board and some activity left, a well-timed threat or a central pawn break can swing the game back in your favor. The approach to cultivate is one that treats the initiative as a living, shifting resource. It rewards players who stay alert to changes in momentum and act decisively when the chance appears. With each move, ask yourself whether you are leading the dance or following your opponent's tune. That question, and the discipline to answer it honestly, is what separates reactive play from genuine mastery in dynamic positions. Chapter 4: Advanced Endgame Tactics. In advanced endgames, the pieces have thinned out, but calculation and precision become even more important. The smallest slip can mean a win turns into a draw, or a draw into a loss. The focus now shifts to specialized tactics that only appear when both sides have limited material and each move carries extra weight. Two of the most powerful tools in this phase are triangulation and Tux-Vang. These are not just tricks, but systematic methods for forcing the opponent into a worse position by manipulating move order and obligation. Triangulation is a way to lose a tempo on purpose. Usually, it is the king that does this, moving in a triangle, 3 moves, 3 squares, ending up back where it started. The reason for this is that in many endgames, whoever is forced to move is worse off. If you can make the same position but switch whose turn it is, you can often win a position that would otherwise draw. Triangulation works best when your opponent has no useful waiting move. If they are out of pawn moves and their king is stuck, you can use triangulation to shift the burden back to them. For example, in king and pawn versus king, both kings might be facing off for control of a key square. By triangulating, your king can force the defending king to give way, allowing your pawn to advance. Tux-Vang goes a step further. It is any situation where the player to move would rather pass, but chess does not allow passing. Any move they make will weaken their position. This arises most often in simple endgames, like king and pawn versus king, but it can also appear in rook or even queen endgames. The key feature is that any legal move by the defender will lose something vital. Maybe they must leave the defense of a square, abandon a pawn, or step away from a blockade. Sometimes Tux-Vang is reciprocal. No matter who moves, that side is worse off. But most often, the stronger side creates Tux-Vang by removing all the defender's useful moves, then forcing them to move at the wrong time. The distinction between triangulation and Tux-Vang is important. Triangulation is a maneuver, a way to lose a move and switch whose turn it is. Tux-Vang is a condition, a position where having the move is a disadvantage. Triangulation is often the tool you use to reach a Tux-Vang position. In practical terms, you are always looking for moments when your opponent is low on options. If their king is stuck, their pawns are out of moves, and their pieces are tied down, check if you can use triangulation to force them to move at the wrong moment. In closed pawn structures, where both sides have run out of pawn moves, this is especially powerful. In some cases, pieces other than the king can triangulate, but this is rare. The queen can sometimes loop back to its starting square in 3 moves if there is space, but the board is often too crowded. Rooks can occasionally maneuver to lose a tempo, but this is less common and not usually called triangulation in standard texts. The pattern to look for is this: your opponent has no good moves, but it is your turn. If you can lose a move and hand them the obligation, you can often force a concession, either a key square, a pawn, or the game itself. This is why advanced endgames are so much about move order and precision. The habit is to ask, in positions with few pieces and limited pawn moves, who actually benefits from being on move. Once you start thinking in these terms, every endgame becomes a search for ways to shift the pressure onto your opponent, one tempo at a time. Stalemate is another tactical resource that changes the way you think about losing positions. Officially, stalemate happens when the player to move has no legal move and their king is not in check. The game ends in a draw, no matter how much material one side has. Many players see stalemate as an accident, but in advanced endgames it can be a deliberate and creative way to escape defeat. Stalemate most often appears when the weaker side has only a king left and is boxed in. But it can also arise in queen, rook, or even minor piece endgames. Sometimes a player with a large material deficit can force a draw by sacrificing their last pieces and leaving their king with no moves. In rook and pawn versus rook endgames, the defender can sometimes force the attacker to capture their rook, creating a stalemate. In queen endgames, bringing the queen too close or pushing a pawn to promotion without care can lead to accidental stalemate if the defending king is trapped. The defender's goal is to look for patterns where their king can be driven to a corner or edge, and then try to arrange the board so that any further capture or advance by the opponent removes all their own legal moves. This often involves sacrificing pawns or even minor pieces to clear the board. One common pattern is pushing a pawn to the promotion square, allowing it to be captured, and leaving the king with no legal moves. Another is allowing the opponent to capture your last piece, so your king is left alone and unable to move. A common misconception is that a lost endgame with no material is hopeless. In reality, as long as you have the chance to create a stalemate net, there is always hope for a draw. The mindset here is to stay alert for these opportunities and to test the opponent's technique. Many endgames at the amateur level are drawn by stalemate, especially when the winning side rushes or fails to check all possible king moves. For the stronger side, the lesson is clear. Always check whether your next move could accidentally stalemate the opponent. For the defender, the habit is to search for ways to force your king into a box, even if it means giving away material. Stalemate is not merely a last resort, it is a tactical tool that can change the outcome of a game in a single move. When you have a small material advantage in the endgame, such as an extra pawn or a slightly more active piece, the challenge is to convert that edge into a win. This is rarely about brute force. It is about finding ways to make steady progress while avoiding traps and counterplay. One of the most reliable methods is to create and push a passed pawn. If you have an extra pawn, your first question is whether you can safely advance it and support it with your king or pieces. King activity is often the deciding factor. Centralizing your king, or using it to escort a pawn, can turn a small edge into a decisive one. Rooks are powerful in endgames. If you have a rook and a pawn against a rook, the key is often to cut off the opposing king from the action, and then build a bridge to shield your pawn as it advances. In these positions, precision matters. A single careless move can allow the defender to set up a fortress or force perpetual check. Piece exchanges are a double-edged sword. Usually, simplifying the position helps the player with a material advantage, but there are exceptions. Some endings are drawn even with an extra pawn, such as opposite-colored bishops or certain rook positions. You need to know which exchanges help you, and which ones could give your opponent drawing chances. A common mistake is advancing pawns without the support of your king or other pieces. Another is pushing the wrong pawn. For example, moving a rook pawn instead of a central pawn can lead to drawn positions, even with extra material. Overconfidence is another danger. Rushing to trade pieces or push pawns without checking for defensive resources, like fortresses, blockades, or stalemate, can throw away the win. The habit to develop is patience. Look for ways to improve your position step by step. Bring your king forward, coordinate your pieces, and only advance pawns when you are sure you cannot be stopped by a blockade or a fortress. Always stay alert for stalemate and perpetual check possibilities. The question to ask is not just how to win, but how to avoid letting the opponent set up a draw. What separates advanced endgame play is the willingness to search for tactical resources, even when the board looks simple. Triangulation, Zugzwang, and stalemate are not rare tricks, but essential tools for shaping the flow of the endgame. When you start to see these tactics as extensions of your strategic play, each position becomes a puzzle in tempo, obligation, and resourcefulness. The mindset shifts from merely holding an advantage to actively creating the conditions where your opponent runs out of good moves. In this way, the endgame becomes less about what is left on the board, and more about how you use every remaining move to tip the balance in your favor. Chapter 5: Complex Middle Game Strategies. Every plan you form in the middle game will eventually collide with something you did not expect. Unlike the endgame, where calculation and concrete technique tend to decide most positions, the middle game is a landscape of shifting threats, competing ideas, and subtle weaknesses. To make sense of this complexity, the first step is learning how to spot the critical weak points in your opponent's position. The most common source of lasting weakness is pawn structure. Doubled, backward, or isolated pawns are usually liabilities, hard to defend, and often blocking piece mobility. Not every structural flaw is fatal, though, and the key distinction already familiar from earlier chapters remains: which weaknesses are permanent and which might dissolve if the opponent finds the right sequence. For example, an isolated pawn that can be traded off is not a true target. But a backward pawn stuck on an open file, with no way to advance or find support, is a seed of long-term pressure. You also need to look beyond pawns. Weak squares often appear after a pawn advance. When a pawn steps forward, it may leave behind a square that cannot be protected by another pawn. A knight outpost is a classic case, a square deep in your opponent's territory that their pawns can never attack, where a planted knight becomes a permanent fixture and a long-term target to build around. Piece coordination is just as important. A bad bishop, trapped behind pawns of its own color, can be a real handicap. If you can lock your opponent's pawns on the same color as their bishop, you restrict its range and force it to defend passively. Rooks tend to shine on open files. If you control an open file, especially by doubling your rooks, you can invade your opponent's position and threaten their weaknesses. When scanning the board, notice whether your opponent's pieces defend each other well, or whether one piece has become overloaded trying to cover too many tasks. Not all weaknesses are equal. Some are temporary, some can be fixed, and some are so deep that they shape the rest of the game. It is easy to chase every small flaw, but what matters is whether you can realistically attack it. If a pawn is weak but cannot be reached, it is not a real target. Cultivate the practice of asking, for each apparent weakness, whether it is permanent, whether you can reach it, and whether attacking it will improve your position or just waste time. Once you have found the real weaknesses, the question becomes how to build a plan. Strong players rarely just look for the next good move in isolation. They tend to form a sequence of ideas aimed at a long-term goal, while staying ready to adjust as the position shifts. One practical method is the candidate moves approach recommended by Kotov, listing the moves that seem promising and exploring each in detail, building a tree of possibilities and pruning the branches that do not work. A good multi-move plan usually starts with a target. Maybe it is an isolated pawn, a weak square, or a poorly placed piece. The plan might involve maneuvering your knight to an outpost, preparing a pawn break, or trading off your worst piece for their best defender. Each move in the plan should serve a clear purpose, such as improving a piece, restricting the opponent's options, or preparing a tactical shot for later. Sometimes the plan is to prevent your opponent's ideas before starting your own. This is prophylaxis, quiet moves that deny your opponent active squares or piece trades before you launch your own plan. What separates a strong plan from a weak one is flexibility. The best plans are not rigid. They include points where you can pause, reassess, and change course if the opponent reacts in an unexpected way. After each move, ask what has changed. Has your plan become easier or harder to carry out? Has your opponent created a new threat or weakness? It is normal for a plan to evolve over several moves. The key is to advance your plan step by step, but always test its validity against what the opponent actually does. This way, your play is guided by purpose but anchored in reality. Even the best plan will sometimes be challenged by an unexpected response. When this happens, the most important skill is adaptability. The first step after a surprise is to pause, breathe, and look at the board with fresh eyes. Avoid the trap of trying to justify your old plan out of routine. Instead, go through a quick checklist. What checks, captures, or threats did this new move create? Has a new square or pawn become weak? Did the opponent open a file or diagonal, or create a tactical resource you missed? Experienced players treat surprises as a signal to recalculate, not to panic. They think for both sides, considering not only their own ideas, but also what their opponent is threatening. If the new move makes your original plan risky, look for ways to simplify or change direction. Sometimes, exchanging pieces or repeating moves is the safest way to avoid trouble. This is the emergency brake in action, a practical tool to reset the position and avoid blunders, not a sign of weakness. Building comfort with uncertainty is at the heart of complex middle game play. The skill to develop is to stay flexible, to see surprises as normal, and to treat each new position as a fresh problem. In this way, the middle game becomes less about following a script and more about steering through a landscape where threats, weaknesses, and opportunities appear and vanish with every move. The real skill is learning to read these shifts and adjust your plans before your opponent does. Chapter 6: Sacrificial Calculations. Sacrificial calculations. A material sacrifice is not a mistake or a moment of desperation. It is a deliberate trade of one kind of advantage for another, and the chess player who understands this has access to a far wider range of plans. Some sacrifices aim for checkmate or a quick material recovery. Others are positional, focused on gaining the initiative, opening lines, or weakening the opponent's king. The question is never simply whether you are down material, but whether what you received in return is worth more. Within this broad category, two patterns emerge. In a temporary or sham sacrifice, you expect to recover the material quickly, often through a forced sequence that leads to checkmate or a decisive position. In a real sacrifice, you accept staying down material, trusting that the benefits in activity, pressure, or long-term threats outweigh the deficit. The discipline to develop is to stop viewing material as an absolute value. Instead, see it as one resource among many. This shift makes sacrifices less about dramatic gestures and more about using every tool available to shape the position in your favor. The reasons for sacrificing vary. Sometimes you want to break through to the enemy king. Other times you are opening a key file or diagonal, creating a passed pawn, or exploiting a weak square. The common thread is that you expect to gain something concrete, attacking chances, more dynamic pieces, or control of an important area of the board. Sound sacrifices are rarely about hope or intuition alone. They are grounded in calculation and a clear sense of what you expect to get in return. When a sacrifice works, it is because the opponent cannot fully defend or avoid lasting problems after accepting the material. To judge whether a sacrifice is justified, you have to weigh the benefits. The main factors are piece activity, king safety, and control of the board. Start by asking if your pieces become more active and coordinate better after the sacrifice. Active pieces can create threats that force the opponent to defend, sometimes for many moves. Next, look at king safety. If your opponent's king is exposed while your own remains secure, this can be a powerful advantage. In many cases, the threat of attack can be as valuable as the attack itself, tying down the defender's forces and limiting their options. Control of key squares, files, or diagonals is another advantage. Sometimes sacrificing material gives you control over an open file, a strong outpost, or the ability to dominate important territory. Pawn structure also matters. If your sacrifice damages the opponent's pawn shield or leaves them with weak pawns, you may gain a lasting advantage. In some cases, just having the initiative, being the one making threats, can be enough, especially if the opponent cannot easily return the material or consolidate. Not all benefits are immediate or obvious. Sometimes the advantages of a sacrifice unfold over several moves. The risk is overestimating short-term threats and missing the fact that the opponent can defend or gradually improve. A common mistake is to sacrifice for a temporary initiative that fades, leaving you down material with no lasting pressure. Another error is ignoring the defender's resources. If the opponent can organize their pieces, trade off attackers, or return material themselves to blunt your threats, the advantage can disappear. Evaluating a sacrifice means being methodical. Consider each factor separately. Is the king exposed? Are your pieces active? Do you control more space or critical squares? Only after this, bring them together for an overall judgment. Sacrificing a pawn for lasting pressure is usually easier to justify than giving up a whole piece. The larger the material you sacrifice, the more concrete your benefits need to be. When you decide to sacrifice, the next step is to calculate the consequences. Start by identifying all forcing moves, checks, captures, and direct threats. For each, imagine what the opponent can do in response. The practice here is to check not just the obvious reply, but also the best defensive options. The calculation branches quickly. The opponent may accept the sacrifice, decline it, or even return material to blunt your attack. Go several moves ahead, aiming to reach a position where you can clearly evaluate what is left. Look for stability. Is the attack still dangerous, or has the initiative faded? Are there hidden defensive resources for your opponent that could turn the tables? If you cannot find a clear way to maintain pressure or recover the material, the sacrifice may be unsound. The danger is stopping your calculation too soon and missing a defensive idea that saves the opponent. Accurate sacrificial calculation is about discipline. As you prepare for the next chapter on counterplay under pressure, remember that sacrifices are not gambles, but projects to be evaluated and weighed before they are executed. Over time, this approach transforms sacrificing material from an act of intuition into a disciplined search for the right balance between risk and reward. Chapter 7. Counterplay under pressure. Counterplay, as introduced in Chapter 3, is the dynamic response to pressure. But knowing the concept and actually applying it under fire are two different things. This chapter is about the practical side, how to find counterplay when your position is cramped or you are down material, and how to use it to change the direction of the game rather than simply endure. When you are defending, your goal is not only to patch up weaknesses, but to find moments where you can put pressure back on your opponent. This works because chess is rarely static. Even in positions where one side seems to have all the advantages, there are often hidden resources for the defender. Counterplay usually means creating threats that force your opponent to respond, taking away some of their freedom and possibly disrupting their plans. A typical example is when a side facing an attack on their king launches a counterattack on the other wing, forcing the attacker to pause and deal with new problems. Another common case is when a defender down in material finds a way to open lines or create threats that make the opponent's extra piece less relevant. The key distinction is that counterplay is not reckless aggression. It is based on careful calculation and an understanding of the position's possibilities. Good counterplay is timed so that the threats you create are real and force your opponent to rethink their plan. When counterplay is successful, it can even cause a complete reassessment of the position. What looked like a clear advantage for one side can become unclear or even balanced if the defender's threats are strong enough. The moment when the attacker has to respond to your threats instead of following their own plan is when the momentum starts to shift. The goal is to transform defense into a proactive strategy. The defender who finds counterplay is not just holding on, but actively shaping the game's direction. This is the moment where the balance of power begins to change. Finding counterplay starts with an honest look at the board, even when the situation feels uncomfortable. The strongest cue is often the presence of a target in your opponent's camp. An exposed or under-defended king is a classic sign. Advanced pawns that create holes or weak squares can also become points of pressure. Sometimes your own pieces are not doing much. In those cases, ask how you can activate them, especially toward the opponent's side of the board. Open or half-open files are prime areas for rooks to become active, even when you are on the defensive. Long diagonals for bishops or queens can also be powerful, especially if they point toward the opponent's king or key pawns. Pawn breaks are another tool. If your position is cramped, look for ways to challenge the opponent's pawn structure and open lines for your pieces. Creating a passed pawn on the side of the board opposite the main action, as covered in Chapter 4, is a well-known method to force your opponent to divert resources. While searching for counterplay, it is important to avoid certain traps. One is making pawn pushes that do not actually create threats, but just leave new weaknesses. Another is trading away your own active or well-placed pieces for ones that are not doing much for your opponent. This can leave you with fewer resources to generate threats. There is also the risk of overestimating your chances. Sometimes a position is simply bad, and pushing for activity can make things worse if it exposes your king or weakens your last defenders. To effectively find counterplay, develop a mental checklist that helps you identify opportunities. Look for targets on the opponent's side, inactive pieces in your own camp, open files, long diagonals, and possible pawn breaks. Consider whether you can generate threats that force your opponent to respond. Evaluate both immediate and longer-term possibilities. If the clock is running low, stay practical and avoid getting lost in overly complex calculations. The aim is to search for active ideas without compromising your position further. The real test of counterplay is whether your threats are strong enough to distract or disrupt your opponent's plan. If you can create a situation where the attacker must stop and deal with your ideas, you have succeeded in changing the flow of the game. Playing under pressure is as much a mental challenge as a technical one. It is common to feel a sense of dread or to want to play safe, passive moves when your position is worse. The most frequent psychological barrier is the fear of losing material, which can make you reluctant to consider active, risky-looking moves. Another is the tendency to mentally resign, thinking the position is lost and giving up on searching for resources. Strong players break through these barriers by focusing on concrete resources. Pattern recognition plays a large role. Experienced players have typically encountered many defensive and counter-attacking motifs, which tends to help them identify where chances are most likely to appear. Even if you do not have years of experience, you can train this habit. Each move, apply the checks, captures and threats portion of the thinking routine covered in Chapter 13 to both sides of the board. Calculate forcing lines first. Sometimes a sequence of checks or captures can reveal hidden counterplay ideas. Staying calm is one of the most important factors in finding good defensive resources. Brief breathing or relaxation techniques can help manage anxiety and clear your mind, especially during complicated defensive calculations. The key mindset shift is to move from trying not to lose to looking for ways to fight back. Instead of only protecting weaknesses, start targeting your opponent's vulnerable points. Optimism in defense is not about ignoring the danger. It is about continuing to put in the calculation effort and refusing to give up on finding resources, even when the position looks bad. This mindset of seeking active solutions, rather than resigning yourself to a slow loss, is what transforms defense into a strategic advantage. Once you start treating defensive situations as a chance to create problems for your opponent, the board looks different. You are actively shaping the fight with every move, ready to seize any opening the moment it appears. This shift in perspective is what separates players who merely survive from those who find genuine resources when it matters most. Chapter 8: Positional Sacrifices. Imagine a chess game where the immediate thrill of capturing pieces takes a backseat to a more profound strategy. Positional sacrifices transcend the classic idea of giving up material for a fast attack or a quick win. Here you are trading material for enduring advantages that can shape the entire game. This is a deliberate, long-term decision. You might give up a pawn, an exchange, or even a piece, and remain down in material for many moves. What you gain might be better control of key squares, a healthier pawn structure, or simply the ability to put steady pressure on your opponent. The reasoning behind a positional sacrifice is rooted in compensation. This could be the bishop pair in an open position, extra space to maneuver, or a permanent weakness in your opponent's camp that you can target. Sometimes the compensation is abstract, like a long-lasting initiative, or the ability to keep your opponent's pieces passive. It is important to recognize that these sacrifices are based on trust in your evaluation, that the resulting position will offer better prospects in the long run. Making a positional sacrifice requires discipline. These are not speculative gambles or flashy moves played on a whim. The decision is built on careful evaluation of the board. You weigh the potential positional gain against the clear cost in material. You accept that the compensation may take time to materialize, and that you may have to defend your position for a while before your advantages become clear. Sometimes the positional sacrifice is made to attack, but just as often, it is used as a defensive resource to relieve pressure or to improve your coordination for the future. What sets positional sacrifices apart is this willingness to value long-term assets over material count. The habit to build is to look at the board and ask what you can create or destroy in the position by giving something up. When you start to see your pieces and pawns as tools for shaping the future, rather than just as points to be counted, positional sacrifices become a natural part of advanced strategic thinking. One of the most practical uses of a positional sacrifice is to influence your opponent's pawn structure. Pawns largely define the landscape of the board. When you give up material, often a pawn, your goal might be to disturb that landscape in a way that creates long-term weaknesses. A clearance sacrifice is a classic example. By sacrificing a pawn, you can open a file, diagonal, or square for your own pieces to use. Sometimes the value of a square is greater than the pawn itself, especially if that square becomes a base for launching further operations. A common outcome is that your sacrifice forces your opponent to make a decision about their pawns. They might have to capture, which could leave them with doubled pawns, an isolated pawn, or a hole in their position. A hole in their camp, as established earlier, cannot be guarded by a pawn and does not disappear once created. This kind of weakness does not disappear. Once you have created it, you can use it as a base for your pieces or as a target for future attacks. If your opponent's pawns are all on one side of the board, sacrificing a pawn on the other side can create squares that cannot be defended by pawns, giving you new opportunities. The real strength of targeting pawn structure with a sacrifice is the chain reaction it sets off. Weakening one pawn can lead to more weaknesses. Open lines appear. Your pieces become more active. The opponent is forced to defend, often passively, while you build up pressure. The compensation is experienced over time as the position shifts in your favor. This is why assuming every good sacrifice must lead to an instant threat can lead you astray. Sometimes the best positional sacrifices are the ones that quietly change the character of the game, making your opponent's task more difficult with every move that follows. Strategic piece exchanges are another dimension of the positional sacrifice. Here, the aim is to use exchanges to take control of key squares or lines, even if it means giving up material in the process. The most common example is exchanging a less active piece for one of your opponent's defenders, clearing the way for your own piece to occupy a strong square. A strong square, as covered earlier, cannot be challenged by an opponent's pawn, making it an ideal outpost for a knight, bishop, or even a rook. When you plan a positional sacrifice involving a piece exchange, your focus is on lasting control. You might give up the exchange for a minor piece if it means your knight can anchor itself deep in enemy territory where no pawn can chase it away. Or you might trade off a bishop if it frees up a square for your remaining pieces to dominate. The decision about which piece to exchange is about removing a key defender, clearing space, or ensuring your own piece will thrive in the new structure. The subtlety in these exchanges comes from their cumulative effect. Each trade shapes the board, sometimes in small ways that add up to a major shift in control. You are not just swapping pieces. You are engineering a position where your remaining pieces are more active, more stable, and more influential than your opponent's. The compensation you seek is real and lasting. It is the difference between a passive piece and one that dominates the board from a strong square. Once you start to see positional sacrifices as a way to shape the game's future, rather than chase quick rewards, your sense of the board deepens. The value of a pawn or a piece is no longer fixed. It becomes a resource you can invest to create the kind of positions where your strengths matter most. This is more than a technical skill. It is a change in perspective. Each sacrifice is a question to the position. What can I build here that will last longer than the material I gave up? The answer is often found in the slow, steady growth of your position as your opponent struggles to untangle the imbalances you have created. Chapter 9: Exploiting Time Controls. When you move from studying positional sacrifices to the practical side of playing, the pace of the game starts to matter as much as the moves themselves. The clock is always running. Every move you make, every second you spend deliberating, is part of the game, and yet most players treat time as an afterthought until they are suddenly scrambling to avoid losing on the flag. Time controls: blitz, rapid, and classical, each set a different tempo, and that tempo shapes your decisions from the very first move. In blitz, you typically have between 3 and 5 minutes per player for the entire game, sometimes with a small increment added per move. Rapid typically gives each player between 10 and 60 minutes, offering meaningfully more time to calculate and recall preparation. Classical chess, on the other hand, can give each player 90 minutes or more for the first 40 moves, sometimes with extra time added after that. These differences are not just technicalities. They change which openings work best and how deeply you can rely on your preparation. The key point is that no single opening repertoire fits all time controls equally well. In blitz, strong players often pick openings that lead to positions they know inside and out. These are usually systems with clear development plans and little need for long calculation. The goal is to avoid getting bogged down in unfamiliar lines or deep theory, especially because one surprising move from your opponent can force you to burn valuable seconds trying to recall details. That is why, in blitz, practical familiarity often outweighs theoretical depth. You want to get a safe king and pieces on good squares quickly so you can make moves almost automatically. In rapid, there is a bit more room to play more ambitious lines, but the same principle holds. The less time you have, the more important it is to be comfortable in the positions you reach. In classical chess, the calculation shifts. With much more time available, you can afford to enter complicated or theoretical openings. You have the luxury of thinking through sharp variations and recalling detailed lines. That is why elite players often keep separate repertoires for fast and slow time controls, using simplified, low-theory systems in blitz, but returning to their main, deeply prepared lines in classical games. The trade-off is always between depth and comfort. Highly theoretical lines can offer an advantage if you know them better than your opponent, but in fast games, the risk of forgetting a move or spending too long on one decision grows. Flexibility is one of the most valuable habits you can develop. The habit to build is to match your opening choices to the time control, not to treat your repertoire as fixed. The more you adapt your approach, the more likely you are to find your openings setting you up for practical success, rather than trapping you in your own preparation. Managing the clock is a skill with its own set of techniques. The first habit is to use your opponent's time to think. While they are deciding, scan the board for threats, review your candidate moves, and refresh your plans. This keeps your thinking sharp and means you are ready to move decisively when your turn comes. Another key is to avoid lingering too long on moves in the opening. Save your time for the middle game, where positions are most complex and decisions matter most. Many strong players set a simple rule for themselves. In non-critical positions, do not spend more than a set number of seconds per move. If you find yourself repeatedly considering the same options, it is often better to commit and move on than to let indecision drain your clock. Critical moments, positions where the game could shift or a big decision must be made, deserve extra time. The mistake is not recognizing these moments and treating every move as equal. When the position is sharp or unclear, invest the time you have saved. In time trouble, focus on making moves that keep the game going. Searching for the perfect move under pressure often leads to blunders. It is better to play a solid, safe move than to freeze up trying to calculate everything. Some players find it helpful to build a routine for the tense moments. This could be as simple as taking one slow breath before moving or narrowing your focus to just 2 or 3 candidate moves. The point is to keep your process stable, even as the clock winds down. When you sense yourself rushing or getting anxious, stabilize your approach. Overthinking and time scrambles are common traps, but steady habits help you avoid them. Time trouble is not just a technical problem. It is a psychological one. When your opponent is low on time, their discomfort often shows up in the way they move. You might notice them making moves faster than before, glancing at the clock more often, or fidgeting between moves. In classical games, they might even stop recording moves once they fall below 5 minutes, as FIDE rules permit players to stop keeping score when less than 5 minutes remain on their clock without increment. These signs are signals that the pressure is getting to them. The way to exploit this is not to rush yourself, but to keep the position tense and present them with choices. Moves that create several small problems at once are especially effective. They force your opponent to make quick decisions and increase the chance of a mistake. This does not mean you should attack recklessly. Overextending just because your opponent is short on time can backfire, exposing your own weaknesses. It is also easy to get caught up in their time scramble and neglect your own clock, leading to mutual time trouble. A practical approach is to look for subtle tactical traps or ways to maintain tension without taking unnecessary risks. If both players are low on time, maintaining a steady physical approach, moving pieces with the same hand motion, keeping your breathing even, can help you stay calm and continue making good moves. The psychological edge comes from composure. While your opponent is feeling the pressure, your steadiness becomes its own weapon. When you learn to read these moments and adjust your game to the tempo, you gain an extra layer of control. Time pressure is not just a threat to be feared, but a resource to be managed and, at the right moment, a weakness in your opponent to be quietly exploited. The real shift is learning to think of time as part of the position itself, not merely a background constraint ticking away behind the moves. This habit deepens your practical play and opens up new ways to shape the battle on the board. Chapter 10: Recognizing and Using Patterns. The gap between a player who sees tactics and one who sees plans often comes down to a single underlying skill: the ability to recognize and use complex patterns. At the advanced level, pattern recognition transcends simply spotting a fork or a pin. It involves seeing the outlines of plans and threats that incorporate many pieces and unfold over several moves. The difference between basic and complex pattern recognition comes down to depth and coordination. A basic pattern is a single move tactic, a knight fork, a pin, or a back rank mate. These are important, but they are immediate and usually visible with a quick scan. Complex pattern recognition goes further. Here, you are looking at sequences where several tactical motifs work together. For example, a rook sacrifice on h7, followed by a queen and bishop invasion, is not just a one-move trick. It is a configuration that requires you to see how the sacrifice, the follow-up, and the coordination of your pieces all fit into one plan. This kind of structural idea often includes both attacking and defensive concepts, involves multiple pieces from both sides, and can depend on precise move order. Sometimes the key is an intermediate move that keeps the threat alive or sidesteps a defense. Advanced players draw on a mental library of these complex motifs, seeing groups of pieces, pawn structures, and squares as interconnected systems rather than isolated units. For example, in positions with opposite-side castling, recognizing the strategy involves more than just pushing pawns. It requires understanding how a pawn storm, a sacrifice, and piece invasion can combine to trap a king. Defensive configurations are just as complex. A fortress, for example, is not a single move but a coordinated setup of pieces and pawns that blocks all entry points, even when down material. What makes these patterns hard to spot is that they rarely look exactly the same from one game to the next. The surface details change, but the underlying relationships, piece coordination, pawn structure, and timing are what matter. This is why recognizing these motifs is a foundation for deeper calculation and planning. It lets you see further ahead and spot opportunities or dangers that would be invisible if you were only looking for simple tactics. The ability to recognize these configurations is not fixed at birth. It develops through sustained practice and study. The key method is repeated exposure to instructive positions. This means not just solving tactical puzzles, but studying master games where complex patterns appear at critical moments. Annotated games by players like Kasparov, Tar, and Karpov can be especially useful because they often highlight how a plan develops, how sacrifices are set up, and how piece coordination is achieved. One effective way to train this skill is to focus on a single motif, such as the exchange sacrifice on c3 or f3, and study several games where it appears. Notice how each example is different, but the core pattern is the same. The aim is not to memorize moves, but to absorb the shape of the ideas. Over time, this exposure builds intuition. You start to recognize the signs of a pattern even before all the details are clear. Deliberate practice is important. This means actively trying to predict moves, pausing to ask yourself what the plan is, and testing your understanding before checking the answer. Passive review, such as replaying games without actively engaging, tends to produce limited improvement on its own. The real learning comes from making mistakes, getting feedback, and revisiting similar positions later. Spaced repetition helps here, strengthening memory links and making patterns easier to spot automatically over time. A common mistake is to train only with very simple tactics, or to memorize concrete variations without understanding why the moves work. This tends to build shallow knowledge that transfers poorly to new situations. Another pitfall is to overload your training with too many new motifs at once, which can overwhelm your working memory. The most effective approach is to focus on a few key complex patterns at a time, build depth, and then gradually expand your mental library. The real test of pattern recognition is not just in finding your own ideas, but in anticipating what your opponent will recognize. Strong players are always asking, what patterns will my opponent see in this position? Will they spot the threat if I set up a multi-move sacrifice, or will they miss the defensive resource? This anticipation shapes how you plan. Sometimes, you can set traps by steering the game into positions where your opponent has missed similar motifs in the past. Other times, you avoid obvious patterns if you know your opponent is well prepared for them. A practical way to gauge an opponent's pattern recognition is to notice how quickly they respond to complex threats or how they handle typical structures. If they struggle with certain motifs, say exchange sacrifices or fortress defenses, you can aim to reach those positions again. You might choose move orders that create complex, unbalanced middle games if you think your opponent is less comfortable in those waters. In team play or matches, players often prepare by reviewing an opponent's games to spot these strengths and weaknesses. There are risks in this approach. If you overestimate your opponent, you might avoid good moves out of caution. If you underestimate them, you might walk into a trap yourself. It is also possible to get so focused on testing your opponent that you neglect your own position or use too much time searching for complicated ideas. The habit to build is to treat pattern recognition as a two-way street. It is not just about what you see, but about what your opponent is likely to see or miss. This awareness lets you shape the game, choosing plans that play to your strengths and test your opponent's limits. When you start to think in these terms, the board opens up. Each position is not just a puzzle to solve, but a conversation between your ideas and your opponent's ability to recognize and respond. This is where the real depth of chess lives, in the quiet, ongoing search for patterns that reveal the hidden logic of the position. Chapter 11: Dynamic Material Imbalance. Dynamic material imbalance in chess is about more than just counting pieces. It describes positions where the types of pieces each side has are different, and the real value of those pieces depends on how actively they are working together. In these situations, the side that is technically down in material is not always worse. Instead, the position can be full of possibilities, with the balance shifting back and forth based on initiative, piece activity, and threats. A simple example of material imbalance is when one side has a rook and the other has two minor pieces. On paper, these are roughly equal. But if the two minor pieces are active and coordinated, they can outplay the rook. On the other hand, a rook working with passed pawns on an open board can be much stronger. The same logic applies to more complex imbalances, like a queen against two rooks, or a rook and pawn versus a pair of bishops. The key idea here is that dynamic material imbalances are unstable by nature. Their value can swing quickly, depending on whose pieces are more active or whose threats are more immediate. Unlike static imbalances, which change slowly if at all, dynamic imbalances can completely reverse within a few moves. This means you cannot just rely on the traditional piece values, such as a bishop being worth 3 pawns, or a rook being worth 5. You have to look at what each piece is doing right now. Piece activity is central. A rook trapped behind its own pawns is worth less than a knight that is attacking key squares. If you have extra material but your opponent's pieces are swarming around your king, you may actually be in danger. Conversely, sometimes giving up material for open lines or active play can be worth more than keeping an extra pawn or exchange. Another important factor is the initiative. If you are the one making threats and forcing your opponent to respond, your pieces become more valuable in practice. The moment you lose the initiative, your compensation for material might disappear. This is why dynamic imbalances demand constant attention. You need to keep asking, are my pieces active? Am I making threats? Is my opponent forced to defend, or do they have time to improve their position? The habit to build is not to judge a position only by the number of pieces each side has. Instead, train yourself to see the potential of each side's resources. This includes not just the pieces themselves, but also factors like pawn structure, king safety, and the ability to create new threats. When you start to see material imbalance as a source of opportunity, you will find more ways to unsettle your opponent and create practical chances. Creating complexity with material imbalance is a practical tool for disrupting your opponent's plans. One way to do this is by sacrificing material to generate counterplay. For example, in certain openings, players will give up the exchange, that is, trade a rook for a minor piece, to damage the opponent's pawn structure or open lines for their own heavy pieces. In the Sicilian defense, a common pattern is for black to capture a knight on the c3 square with a rook. This damages white's pawns, opens files, and often leads to increased activity for black's remaining pieces. These sacrifices are not random. They are prepared patterns, tested over many games. The side that sacrifices material is often betting that the resulting activity and pressure will outweigh the material loss, at least for the next several moves. The position becomes more complex, and both sides are forced to calculate carefully. When you have extra material, the usual plan is to try to restrict your opponent's counterplay and simplify the position. But when the position is complicated by imbalance, this is not always easy. The side with less material can create threats that force mistakes or win back material. Sometimes, just gaining a single tempo, a single move where your opponent must respond, can change the evaluation of the whole position. Complexity often leads to practical chances, because it becomes harder for both sides to calculate every possibility. Mistakes are more likely. This is why dynamic material imbalance is not only about theory but about practical play. You are not just trying to find the best move, but to create a situation where your opponent is more likely to go wrong. The pattern to notice is that complexity gives the side with less material a chance to seize the initiative. By creating new threats, opening lines, or attacking weak pawns or squares, you can keep the position unstable and force your opponent to keep finding accurate moves. If they slip, the balance can swing back in your favor. Navigating unstable positions with dynamic material imbalance requires a disciplined approach. The first step is precise calculation. You cannot rely on intuition alone, because the position can change with every forcing move. Start by identifying all the candidate moves, those that create threats, defend key points, or restrict your opponent's options. Then, check each line carefully, looking for tactical resources that might shift the balance. It is also important to reassess the position after every forcing sequence. In these positions, the value of your compensation can disappear if you lose a single tempo, or if your opponent finds a hidden defensive resource. For example, if you have sacrificed material for activity, you need to check if your threats are still real after each move, and whether your opponent can start to untangle their pieces or generate counterplay of their own. Flexibility is essential. Be ready to change plans if the position shifts. Sometimes, giving back material at the right moment can simplify the position and secure a draw or even a win. Other times, you need to keep the tension and search for ways to increase your activity. A practical method is to compare your candidate moves directly on the board, checking each one for both tactical and positional consequences. Invest the time to look for hidden resources, both for yourself and for your opponent. When you find a line that reduces your opponent's counterplay while keeping your own threats alive, that is usually the path to prefer. Another habit to build in these positions is to periodically step back and reevaluate the material balance, especially if pawns are being traded or if pieces are exchanged. The arrival or loss of a bishop pair, for example, can change the whole character of the position. In rook versus knight or rook versus bishop endgames, look for chances to create passed pawns, since knights in particular struggle to stop pawns on the outside files. The skill to develop is disciplined, ongoing evaluation. Instead of trusting an earlier judgment, keep asking whether your compensation is holding up, whether your opponent has new ideas, and whether the balance of activity and threats has shifted. In dynamic material imbalance, the board is never settled for long. Every move is a new opportunity to tip the scales, if you are alert enough to see it. Chapter 12: Strategic King Placement. The king's role in chess is not fixed. In the early stages, the king is vulnerable and must be protected, but as the position changes, especially as pieces are traded, the king's potential grows. It is important to recognize that the king is not just a liability to be hidden away. In advanced play, the king can become a powerful piece, able to shift the balance of a position when given the right circumstances. As material leaves the board, the king's ability to influence the outcome rises sharply. Several key factors shape this process. The king's distance to passed pawns, its mobility, its proximity to the center, and its exposure to potential checks all matter. In many endgames, activating the king to support the advance of a passed pawn is not just helpful, but frequently the key factor in deciding the outcome. The same is true in rook endgames, where a centralized king can assist the rook in cutting off the opponent's king, or in shepherding pawns forward. The king's activity is not limited to pure pawn endings. Even with minor pieces remaining, a well-placed king can restrict the movement of an enemy knight or bishop and shore up weak points in your own camp. What matters is the king's ability to control important squares and coordinate with other pieces. The main obstacle to king activity in the middle game is the presence of queens or major pieces, which can threaten mate or perpetual check. Once those threats have faded, either through simplification or careful calculation, the king's latent power can be unlocked. Many players are reluctant to move the king from its castled position, treating any forward step as inherently unsafe. These ideas can hold you back from making use of one of your most important resources. In practical play, it is common to see the king become active in late middle game positions where queens have been exchanged, even if other pieces remain. The key is to recognize when the board has become quiet enough for the king to step forward without inviting disaster. Once you start looking for moments to activate the king, the next step is to consider how best to move it. Strategic king maneuvers depend on both the phase of the game and the specific features of the position. In the endgame, one of the strongest maneuvers is to bring the king toward the center along the shortest safe route. Center squares increase the king's reach and allow it to switch quickly between flanks. This maneuver is especially important after major attacks have subsided and the risk of mate has dropped. Another common pattern is to use the king as a shield for advancing pawns. In king and pawn endings, the king often walks in front of its own pawn to block checks and clear the way for promotion. In rook endgames, a king can support its rook by helping to cut the opponent's king off along a file or rank. In bishop endings, the king and bishop can work together to block the enemy king from crossing into key areas. With knights, the king's help may be needed to attack or blockade pawns that the knight cannot directly target due to its limited range or colorblind movement patterns. Timing matters. The trigger for king activation is often a major exchange, such as the trade of queens or both pairs of rooks. Once these pieces are gone, the risk of direct attack drops, and king's centralization becomes not only safe but necessary. There are also cases in the middle game where the king may need to walk away from a threatened wing and reposition toward the center or the opposite flank, especially in situations where both sides have castled on opposite sides and a pawn storm is coming. Risks remain. Moving the king too soon can allow the opponent to gain time by checking it, or even to open lines with pawn breaks that were not previously dangerous. If the king abandons the defense of its own pawns before the position is ready, those pawns can fall. The calculation must be concrete. It is not enough to know that king activity is good in the abstract. Each move must be weighed against the threats that remain. The core trade-off is between safety and activity. The balance depends on several factors: the presence of enemy pieces that can attack, the openness of files near the king, and the existence of tactical patterns like checks, discovered attacks, or forks. The standard guideline is that king's centralization is usually justified after the queens are off. But there are exceptions. Sometimes, even with a rook or minor piece on the board, the enemy's pieces are so poorly placed that your king can advance with little risk. At other times, even in a material-light endgame, open lines or weak squares make king activity dangerous. The decision is rarely made by a fixed rule. It requires practical assessment of the board, the threats each side can generate, and the potential for the king to play a role in the outcome. Overestimating the danger can lead to a passive king that becomes a target for pawn breakthroughs or positional squeeze. Underestimating it can lead to the king stumbling into a mating net or losing key tempi to checks. There is also a psychological layer. When you bring your king into the center, it signals confidence and control. Opponents may sometimes react by searching for threats that are not there, losing time, or making inaccurate moves. The habit worth building is to treat king placement as a dynamic part of your strategy, rather than defaulting to passivity out of caution. The king is a piece with power that must be evaluated like any other, sometimes to be hidden, sometimes to be brought forward as the deciding force. The shift is to see the king as a participant in the fight, not just a bystander to be protected. Chapter 13. Handling Unexpected Openings. Your opponent deviates on move 3. The position is unfamiliar. Your preparation runs out, and the clock is ticking. This is not a crisis. It is exactly the kind of moment where understanding outweighs memory, and where flexibility becomes your most reliable weapon. You are not trying to force every game into your comfort zone. Instead, you want to keep your position healthy, no matter what your opponent does. When you face something unfamiliar, your first job is to stay calm. Do not rush or try to punish the opponent right away. Many offbeat openings are not immediately dangerous, though some do contain genuine venom that rewards calm, principled play. The practical approach is to fall back on principles that work in almost any position. Focus on developing your minor pieces and controlling the center with your pawns. This order keeps your king safe and your position stable. Coaches like Igor Smirnov stress that these are the real priorities, not memorizing long move orders. Flexibility also means not making too many pawn moves early on. Each pawn move changes your structure and can create weaknesses, especially if you push the side pawns or advance too many at once. The habit is to start with one central pawn, usually the D or E pawn, and support it with another if needed. This gives you a strong foothold in the center but leaves your structure adaptable. Develop your knights and bishops before you think about moving your queen or rooks. By keeping your setup broad and not committing to a specific plan too early, you leave yourself options for whatever the opponent does next. It is normal to feel unsettled when the opponent leaves known paths. The risk is to react impulsively, either by copying their moves or by trying to force the game back into familiar territory. A common mistake is to overreact, either by making a premature pawn push, grabbing material without enough support, or weakening your own position. The steadier method is to check for direct threats after each move, then calmly continue with your own development plan unless you see a clear reason to change course. Pattern recognition is another quiet tool here. As covered earlier, experienced players draw on familiar structures rather than calculating every move from scratch, and that same instinct applies when navigating unfamiliar openings. If you have developed your pieces sensibly and castled, you are less likely to find yourself in serious trouble, even if the moves are new to you. This is the backbone of flexibility. You trust the general framework and adjust only when the board gives you a concrete reason. The habit is to ask, with each move, does this change what I need to do, or can I keep building my position step by step? When your opponent is relying on a surprise opening, their main hope is to catch you off balance or out of your preparation. The way to neutralize this is to keep the game in a zone where both sides are making decisions based on principles, not on memory. The first thing to look for in these situations is whether their setup has left any immediate weaknesses. Unusual openings often mean their pieces or pawns are not ideally placed, or that they have made too many pawn moves themselves. One method is to continue developing your minor pieces toward the center and castle as soon as practical. This gives you a safe king and active pieces, which are the foundation for any plan. After you have castled and finished basic development, look for ways to bring your queen and rooks to central or semi-open files. This increases your control and helps you spot opportunities. Central control remains the anchor. If the opponent has pushed a central pawn that is not well supported, it can become a natural target. For example, a pawn advanced to d4 or e4 without adequate support may sit closer to your pieces and become an easier target. Applying pressure to an under-defended pawn is a standard method for challenging offbeat setups. Sometimes a move like qb6 can create a double attack on two pawns, forcing the opponent to make concessions. Another recurring plan is to trade off a problematic piece, such as a strong bishop that could become dangerous if left unchecked. If you can exchange your bad bishop for their good one, or neutralize their main source of activity, you often take the sting out of their preparation. Throughout this, apply the CCTO thinking routine before each move to check for immediate checks, captures, and threats. This helps avoid blunders and stops you from walking into prepared tactics. If you do not see a forcing move that achieves something concrete, keep improving your position instead. Do not allow the opponent to plant pieces deep in your half of the board without a fight. Treat this as a signal to reassess your priorities and push back. Once the early surprise has passed and both sides are out of memorized lines, the game becomes about building original plans. The question to ask is not, what is the right move in this opening? But, what is my plan in this position? The answer depends on the structure you see. If there is a central pawn chain, you might focus on attacking its base. If you have a bishop blocked by your own pawns, look for ways to trade it off or open lines for it. If the opponent has a loose pawn or a vulnerable piece, consider how to build pressure. Creativity becomes important when the position is new, but it must be grounded in logic. The balance is between sticking to core principles and being willing to try something unfamiliar if the position calls for it. Sometimes, a calculated risk, like a pawn break or a piece sacrifice, can disrupt the opponent's plan, but only if you have a clear idea of the compensation. The CCTO thinking routine, check, capture, threat, optimize, gives you a framework for generating ideas. If there is no check, capture, or threat that works, look for ways to improve your pieces, even if the improvement is small. Adding pressure to a protected piece can sometimes overload the opponent's defense and force a mistake. Pattern recognition helps here too. The more you see similar structures, the faster you spot plans that work. That mental library, built through repeated study, continues to pay dividends here, helping you form plans that are both creative and safe. When you navigate an unexpected opening and build a coherent plan that fits the position, you are not just surviving. You are shaping the game on your own terms, even in unfamiliar territory. This approach fosters a quiet confidence. Instead of fearing surprises, you embrace them as opportunities to test and expand your understanding. Each new position becomes a canvas for your ideas, guided by the logic and structure of the board in front of you. Chapter 14. Manipulating Pawn Breaks. A single pawn move can crack open a locked position, expose a king, or transform a passive bishop into a dominant force. That is the power of a well-timed pawn break. At this stage, the focus shifts from simply adjusting to the opponent's moves to actively shaping the board. The key idea here is that a pawn break is not just a pawn push. Used well, it actively reshapes the board in ways that ripple through the structure for many moves. To use pawn breaks well, you need to judge both the timing and the execution. Timing in this context means more than just waiting for an opening. It is about sensing when the position is ready for a break, when your pieces are coordinated, your opponent's defenses are stretched, or when the break will create problems the opponent cannot easily solve. Execution is about the sequence of moves that make the break effective. Preparation is essential. Bring your pieces to the right squares, coordinate their action, and only then execute the break. Remove defenders or overprotect a critical point, so that when the break happens, the consequences are in your favor. A common mistake is confusing any pawn push with a true break. The distinction matters because not every pawn push qualifies. A true break contacts an enemy pawn with purpose, and a pawn lever specifically targets the base or link of the opponent's chain to open lines or create tension. Pushing a pawn forward without this purpose does not qualify as a break and can create weaknesses in your own camp. The risks of poor timing are real. If you break too soon, you might open lines before your pieces are ready, or allow your opponent to counterattack. If you wait too long, the opponent may consolidate, block the break, or even seize the initiative. Strong players test the break by calculating forcing sequences several moves ahead. They look for cues. Are both sides fully developed? Is the opponent's king secure? Is there a target, such as a pawn lacking support? These are signs the position may be ripe for a break. When the board feels static and neither side has an obvious plan, checking the available pawn breaks, both yours and your opponent's, becomes part of the routine. Once the timing and execution are understood, the next layer is using pawn breaks to create imbalances. The moment you break through a pawn chain or open a file, the structure changes. This can leave behind weaknesses, open lines for your pieces, or force the opponent's pieces into awkward spots. For example, breaking a pawn on the 6th rank might undermine a key square for the opponent's knight, or open a file for your rook. Sometimes the break creates two weaknesses at once, making it difficult for the opponent to defend both. Not all imbalances are to your advantage, so you have to read the position carefully. Some breaks fix the opponent's pawns on certain colors, activating your bishop while trapping theirs behind its own pawns. Other breaks can leave the opponent with hanging pawns, or an isolated pawn, creating long-term targets. In some openings, a well-timed break forces a backward pawn into existence, one that can be pressured for many moves to come. The point is to recognize when the break will shift the equilibrium. If the resulting structure gives you more targets than it gives your opponent, the break is generally worth considering. It is also important to see how pawn breaks force choices. The opponent may have to capture, leave a pawn under attack, or retreat a piece to a worse square. Each of these responses gives you a new angle to press. Sometimes the mere threat of a break makes the opponent tie down their pieces in defense, reducing their flexibility. Good players use this to steer the game toward positions where their strengths become more relevant. When a position is closed and maneuvering dominates, a successful pawn break can transform everything. The locked nature of a closed position means pieces are often stuck behind their own pawns. A break that opens a file or diagonal suddenly activates those pieces. New lines appear for rooks. New diagonals open for bishops, and squares that were blocked become available for both sides. This shift from a closed to an open position is not just a matter of space, it changes the tactical landscape. Pieces that were passive become dangerous. Weaknesses that were protected by a pawn wall may now be exposed. The decision to open a position with a break depends on whether your pieces are better placed to use the new lines. If you open the position too early, your opponent may be the one who benefits from the activity. The instant the position opens, the nature of the fight changes. Tactical possibilities multiply, and the initiative may shift quickly. The habit to develop is to treat pawn breaks as levers that change the shape of the game. Each potential break is a question to the position. What will open? Who will benefit? What new weaknesses or targets will appear? With practice, you start to see that the real power of pawn breaks is not just in the move itself, but in the way it forces both you and your opponent to adapt, sometimes in ways that were not visible before the break. This mindset turns pawn breaks from a simple tactical device into a primary tool for steering the course of the game. Chapter 15: Psychological Aspects of Advanced Play. Advanced chess is not just a contest of calculation and memory. It is also a contest of minds, where reading an opponent's intentions and emotional state can tip the balance in positions that are otherwise equal. At this level, the moves on the board are only part of the information available. The rest comes from subtle patterns, habits, and behaviors that reveal clues about what your opponent is thinking. The skill of reading intentions starts with careful observation. Experienced players notice which part of the board an opponent studies most, or if a player keeps glancing at a certain piece. These habits can hint at where a plan is forming, or where a threat is brewing. For example, if you see your opponent spending extra time looking at the king side, you might suspect a pawn break or piece maneuver is coming in that area. Posture and body language also play a role, though their value is limited and should be treated with caution. Sometimes a player will suddenly lean forward or sit up straight after seeing a new idea. A quick smile, frown, or even a wince can suggest satisfaction, worry, or regret about a move. However, these cues are not always reliable. Strong players know that body language can be used as a tool for deception, so they cross-check what they see with the logic of the game itself. Time management is another important signal. If your opponent moves quickly in a familiar position, it often means they are still following preparation or a well-known plan. A long pause in an opening line might indicate they are surprised or uncomfortable, which can be a good moment to complicate the game or try something new. In time pressure, players often reveal their true preferences and fears through the speed and order of their moves. Move patterns give even more concrete information. For example, if you notice repeated knight moves toward a certain complex of squares, or a string of small defensive moves, it may signal that your opponent is preparing for a specific plan or trying to prevent a known danger. In the endgame, repeated efforts to trade certain pieces can expose your opponent's comfort zone and suggest what kind of ending they are aiming for. The key idea in all of this is balance. Psychological inference works best when combined with objective analysis. If you rely too much on reading your opponent, you risk missing what is really happening on the board, especially if they are deliberately misleading you. Confirmation bias can creep in, pulling your attention toward what you already suspect, and away from what the position is actually showing you. The habit to build is to treat psychological cues as a secondary check, not as the main guide to your decisions. When the position is unclear and multiple plans are possible, These cues can tip the balance. But when the board offers a clear best move, calculation should take priority. Composure under pressure is a core skill for advanced players. The stakes are higher, the margins for error are smaller, and the stress can be intense in critical moments. Stress does not just feel uncomfortable. It can narrow your focus and weaken your ability to calculate deeply or accurately. Research suggests that acute pressure can limit working memory, which is central to juggling variations and spotting tactics. The first step in managing stress is to normalize it. Even elite players feel anxiety in tense positions, or when the game is on the line. The difference is in how they respond. Simple techniques, like taking a slow, deep breath, or briefly shifting your gaze away from the board, can interrupt the buildup of anxiety and clear your mind before returning to calculation. Many top players use mental routines to anchor their thinking. This might be a fixed checklist. What are the threats? What are my candidate moves? What is my opponent's plan? By following the same process each move, you give your mind structure and reduce the risk of panicking or skipping steps under pressure. After a mistake or setback, avoid ruminating. Record the move as usual, then use your opponent's thinking time to reassess the new position objectively. Focus on immediate defensive tasks before considering counterplay. Reframing a blunder as one moment in a long tournament rather than a defining failure is a direct application of emotional tilt prevention, keeping your next moves clear. Players who consistently apply emotional regulation practices often report steadier performance in critical positions. This does not mean you need elaborate rituals. The most effective routines are simple and repeatable. Breathe, reset, return to the checklist. The more you practice these habits, the more natural they become, and the less likely you are to let stress dictate your decisions. Psychological tactics, when used ethically, can influence the outcome of a game in ways that calculation alone cannot. Bluffing, for example, is a documented tool at the advanced level, one that exploits complexity and time pressure to provoke errors rather than relying on objective superiority. Rapid, confident moves can signal deep preparation, causing an opponent to burn time or doubt their own analysis. Intimidation can take more subtle forms. Deliberate piece placement, visible eagerness, or even a long, direct stare are sometimes used to unsettle an opponent. However, there are clear ethical lines. Chess rules forbid actions that distract or disturb, such as loud gestures, invading personal space, or repeated draw offers. Federation codes also prohibit any form of harassment or discrimination. The spirit of psychological tactics is to challenge your opponent's decision-making, not to cross into unsporting behavior. Bluffing works best when the position is genuinely double-edged and time is short. Against an opponent who struggles in chaos or is running low on the clock, even a slightly inferior but tricky move can provoke errors. But this is a double-edged sword. Over-reliance on psychological tricks can lead you to pick inferior moves, hoping for a mistake that might not come. Habitual intimidation can also damage your reputation, drawing the attention of arbiters and leading to stricter rule enforcement. The practice to cultivate is discernment. Use psychological tactics as one tool among many, not as a substitute for sound play. Recognize when your opponent is using similar methods. If you sense an attempt to bluff or unsettle, take a moment to pause, refocus, and concentrate on the position itself. The real advantage comes from integrating psychological awareness with technical skill, so that you can steer tense situations with both clarity and confidence. Advanced chess is ultimately a contest on two levels, the board and the mind. Learning to read intentions without losing sight of the position, managing emotions under fire, and using psychological tools with restraint and awareness adds a layer of control that pure calculation cannot provide. The players who reach the highest levels are those who can see through the noise, stay composed when it matters most, and draw on every resource available to shape the game on their own terms.